As Rob said, my name is Chris. I'm delighted to be with you here this evening. I bring you threefold greetings. First, from Wycliffe College, where I serve as chaplain and director of field education. We would very much like to send you another student for their MDiv placement. Very pleased to hear that a group of you were at our women's breakfast not long ago. So thank you for attending that. I also bring you greetings from the Prayer Book Society of Canada. I'm the vice chairman. You are one of our flagship parishes. We're very proud of you. Thank you especially for your use of the Common Prayer Canada app for mobile devices. A lot of the new features and improvements have been suggestions from this parish. So we thank you for your faithful use of that. There will be some more new features coming shortly.
The rector of St. Thomas's, Huron Street, and the rector of St. Louis, Swansea are among probably. We'd like to think that we are your top two critiquers.
You are.
Okay. Suggestions for improvement.
That's right. And finally, I bring you greetings from the Diocese of the Arctic and the four bishops. I'll be talking about them later. I'm still canonically resident up in the Arctic, even though I'm now living here in Ontario. That brings me to my topic for this evening, the title of which is Arctic Ministry Past and Present. When we think about the history of Arctic missions, it's fitting that we're having this talk on Ascension Day because the ascension of Jesus into heaven is a very important event in the life of our Lord for Inuit Christians. Missionaries and the early Christian converts among the Inuit, they made much of both Christmas and the Ascension. Christmas being the descent of the Son of God to earth, and Ascension being his return to his glorious throne in heaven. Both occasions were celebrated historically in the communities, not only with worship, but also with fun, festive games. That tradition sadly has fallen out of practice for Ascension Day, but it is still very much alive for Christmas. In fact, the Inuktitut word for Christmas is Kuviasuvik, which means literally the time of happiness. And again, they celebrate that with fun, festive games. I'm going to show you a brief video clip of some dancing, one of the popular events at Christmas time, the time of happiness. So this is at the school gym in Iqaluit where the whole community gathers. I was there. I want to begin by talking about Inuit culture and beliefs prior to the arrival of Christian missionaries. So in pre and early contact Inuit culture, the shaman, the Anyakuk, acted as a kind of spiritual leader, a middleman or a middle woman between the human and spiritual realms. The word Anyakuk, it means literally to move about or to go back and forth. So it may suggest that the shaman moved between, again, the human and spiritual worlds, Inuit and non-human, the living and the departed. They had special knowledge or abilities, Kalmanik, as it was called, and this was acquired through many years of ordeals and training, kind of apprenticeship with the senior shaman. And they had spiritual powers that enabled them to move freely across the boundary between the human and non-human world. Shamans had shadow spirits known as Turnrait as their helpers. These were the spirits of their ancestors who assisted them in healing the sick, bringing good weather, and fetching game, animals in periods of famine. Shamans also provided people with protective amulets, kind of like necklaces, and gave them advice about what to do and what not to do, things to do and taboos to avoid. We'll be talking more about taboos in just a minute. It was believed that shamans could predict the future by invoking spirits through various practices of divination. They had a technique where they would tie a string to someone's limb. There'd be an object hanging off of the string. They would ask the person a question, and the shaman would pull on the string. If the person was able to lift the object up, then the answer to the question was understood to be positive. If not, it was understood to be negative. Now, given the harsh landscape of the Arctic and the fact that there's no possibility of agriculture or the raising of livestock, the people were entirely dependent on hunting and fishing for food. Their diet was almost entirely meat-based. And because wild animals are beyond human control, they cannot always be a reliable source of food. And so the threat of starvation was constant. If the hunting ran dry, if the fish weren't around, they would run out of food quite quickly. During times of scarcity, the shaman would travel to the spirit world. They'd work themselves into a kind of trance and have a seance. And they would go and make entreaty to the goddess Sedna, the goddess of the sea, and plead with her to release her bounty, the animals, the sea mammals that she was holding back. Why was she holding back the animals? Because someone in the community, it was thought, broke one of the taboos, broke one of the rules. In other words, if the hunting and fishing were unsuccessful, this was understood to be a kind of spiritual retribution for someone in the community breaking a rule or a taboo. And there were taboos around food. So they would eat most of the animal, but certain parts were off limits. So you couldn't eat the lungs of the caribou for some reason. There were also elaborate rituals for purification after childbirth. Whole society was governed by these rules of clean and unclean, purity, and so on. And if someone broke one of those rules, that was understood to bring misfortune to the community, especially with respect to the provision of food. So the shamans would have these seances, normally in the winter. People would gather together for it. It was a kind of communal event. The shaman would be tied up, bound with string. They would dim the oil lamps, and that was meant to contrast the darkness with the enlightenment of the shaman. They would play drums. There would be chanting incantations, and he would summon or conjure those ancestral spirits I talked about before. The spirit of the shaman would then go into the spirit world, and when it returned after some time, the shaman would explain what he had seen, would talk about his interaction with Sedna, the goddess of the sea, and it would be revealed which taboos had been violated and who violated them. And that culprit, the offending person, would then have to confess their faults and be subjected to some disciplinary action. So shamans, it is quite commonly believed, really did have kind of spiritual power. Many of them would use it for good, to heal people. Others would use it for ill, to cast spells. By the way, I want to recommend the films of this great Canadian filmmaker, Zacharias Kunuk. These shamanistic rituals I just mentioned are depicted in two of his films. This one is an animated film, short movie called The Shaman's Apprentice. And the next one is this great epic film called Atanarjuat, the Fast Runner. This has been called the greatest Canadian film ever made. So I would highly recommend you watch it. It's a kind of 3-hour epic. Just as an aside, Zacharias Kunuk's brother, Methuselah, is an ordained Anglican priest. And he was my predecessor as Dean of the Arctic, and he is a friend of mine. That's Methuselah there. Okay. Christian missionaries arrived in the Eastern Arctic at the turn of the 20th century, so late 1800s. And they made it a priority to put an end to this system of taboos, right? There were many things about Inuit culture that they approved of and affirmed, such as the kind of communitarianism, the sharing of food and so on, but they were not keen on the pagan shamanistic taboos, so they made a priority of putting an end to that. In the North Baffin region, Inuit who converted to the Christian faith often, and sort of to mark their moving on from the taboos, they got together to perform this kind of transitional ceremony. And it was something that they developed. It wasn't imposed by missionaries. It was a kind of quasi-Eucharistic ritual and it involved the eating of a previously forbidden piece of food. Remember, I told you the caribou lung was off limits. They got together and they decided we're going to eat it, right? To mark, it signaled the fact that they were renouncing the old system of taboos, right? So again, this is a sort of serious, solemn moment, and I'm going to show you a video film dramatization of that. As you can imagine, if it was understood that eating the forbidden meat would bring misfortune and even starvation to the community, and that you would be subjected to punishment if you were at fault, you can imagine what it would have been like to do this, right? To swallow that would have been a momentous step, a leaving behind of the past and moving into new territory. And so the ritual, as you can see here, was called sikatirnik. It literally means he or she crosses over from a less dangerous to a more dangerous terrain, or from an unfamiliar, from a familiar to an unfamiliar. Those who embraced the new Christian faith were not afraid to renounce the system of taboos and throw themselves into kind of unknown waters, like a transition from an old to a new covenant. This is another film by Zacharias Kunuk called The Journals of Knud Rasmussen. Knud Rasmussen was a Danish explorer to the Arctic in the 1920s.
Christian, here, come on, okay? Kailang may tumig Jesus ini, ang nakakang niyarok to si, ang kiyang nanakityan.
Okay, so the scene that we just saw, it kind of depicts the fear and solemnity that was involved in renouncing the traditional ways that govern their society. However, documented interviews with elders also note that there was a sense of joy and relief for being liberated from these rules. For example, one elder named Noah Pugatuk said in 1991, quote, "The older people made it known that they found it so much easier to live with the new religion in comparison to the taboo beliefs that they had to live with prior to that time." By the way, the life story of that man is depicted in yet another film by the same director, Zacharias Kunuk, One Day in the Life of Noah Pugatuk. Takes place in the 1950s or 60s. And you here at St. Olave's will be pleased to know that the film begins with him reading his copy of the Inuktitut Book of Common Prayer. This is an elder that I got to know. Her name is Anne Hansen. And she would tell me about the history and said much the same thing as Noah Pugatuk, that the people of her community, so her parents and grandparents, were very happy when the missionaries showed up because they found the taboo system to be burdensome. She was a CBC radio host, and she became the commissioner of Nunavut. Commissioner is what the lieutenant governor is called in the territories. So she was the representative of the monarch. Beginning at the turn of the 20th century, the Christian faith spread and was adopted quite rapidly among the Inuit. In the Eastern Arctic, so Baffin Island, Northern Quebec, further up, Christian teachings tended to be better accepted in places where the shaman himself converted to Christianity. And then the shaman would introduce the Christian faith to his people prior to the arrival of missionaries in many cases. Many shamans became lay readers who would go round to the seasonal camps and outposts. And so they established a kind of unique indigenized Inuit form of Christianity that in some ways preserves certain aspects of the old worldview, namely its emphasis on the unseen spiritual realm. So to this day, Inuit Christians are more comfortable talking about the biblical categories of angels and demons than folks around here tend to be, for example. When I say they preserved aspects of the old system, it's not so much religious syncretism. They are firmly Christian. Shamanism is no longer practiced, and Jesus is understood to be victorious over the forces of darkness and the ruler of the cosmos, hence the importance of the ascension for Inuit. Now, because the Christian faith is based on the Bible and Anglicanism also on the prayer book, missionaries had to teach the Inuit to read and write. Previously, Inuktitut was only an oral language, not a written one. Anglican missionaries became known as Ayurkswiyit, that's the Inuktitut word. It's a word that has various connotations, various possible etymologies. It means teacher, it means speaker, so kind of like rector, the one who speaks. It also means one who speaks at length, talks for a long time. Another elder told me that the word can mean someone who shows us the right way to live. That's the nature of the teaching that is imparted. The first Ayurkswiyi is the missionary whom you see on the screen there, the one on the left, Edmund James Peck. He is commemorated in your Canadian prayer book calendar on September the 10th. He died that day in 1924 here in Toronto, where he retired after his career in the Eastern Arctic. He was British, born and raised near Manchester in England, and he served with the CMS, the Church Missionary Society. He first arrived in the James Bay region of northern Quebec in 1876. That's where there are Cree people to the south and Inuit to the north. And he began the work of learning the Inuktitut language there. In fact, he started learning the language on his boat ride across the Atlantic. I'll read you a quote from his journal. Before leaving England, I was able to obtain from the Moravian Brethren's office in London a copy of the New Testament, which had been translated by the brethren laboring among the Inuit of the coast of Labrador. This to me was a great treasure, which I studied when on the trackless deep, and by carefully comparing it with our English translation, I was able, especially where there was repetition of the same words as in John chapter 1, finally to hit upon the meanings. So he had the Bible or parts of it in Inuktitut, he had his English Bible, and that's how he learned the language. So that copy of the New Testament, as he said, was from the Moravians. The Moravians are an old Protestant church. They trace their roots back to Bohemia, Central Europe. They sent missionaries to the Inuit in Greenland in the mid-18th century. So they were the first to evangelize the Inuit. They were the first to make Inuktitut a written language. However, they used Latin script, A, B's, and C's, just like ours. So Peck's unique contribution to the language was to begin with those Moravian resources, again in Latin script, and convert it into what is now called Canadian Aboriginal syllabics. That's what the alphabet looks like. This was first developed jointly by Methodist missionaries and the Cree people they were serving in Northern Ontario. So that's where Peck met them. He could see that this syllabic system was intuitive for the Cree, and he thought it would be a better fit for Inuktitut. So that's what he did. He took the Moravian resources in Latin script, he converted it to this. And by all accounts, this syllabic writing system was hugely successful. It was natural and intuitive for the Inuit, and it allowed literacy to spread very quickly. And again, he would translate catechisms and Bible portions and portions of the prayer book and hymns. These were the first things ever written in Inuktitut. He'd get them printed in England, shipped back, he would give them to the people, and then the Inuit would go and take those materials and use it to evangelize other Inuit and teach other Inuit how to read and write, because they were just learning themselves. So the spread of the gospel went hand in hand with the spread of literacy. Why did syllabics take off? Why is this system such a natural fit for the Inuktitut language? Probably because Inuktitut words can get really long. They have a root word, and then there can be affixes, things that are added on to the end. And the result of this is that an entire sentence in English is one word in Inuktitut. So look at that huge word right here. I have to go to the airport. That's one word. So the first part is airport, mu is go to, riaka is obligation, I have to do it, lak indicates that it's going to happen in the future, and tunga is me, I'm doing it. Notice how the order is inverted. It's totally reversed, right? I comes first in English, airport is last. Here it's airport, go to I, right? So notice I didn't count up the number of letters, but it'd be well over 20, like almost 30 letters in Latin script. But in syllabics, it's considerably shorter because each syllabic character is a syllable. It's a consonant and a vowel. So you can see how the language is more manageable with these syllables. So I think that's why it was so successful. It's still used to this day, though more and more you see Inuktitut in Roman orthography now as well. And that, by the way, is the new Iqaluit airport. Back to Peck, he again learned the language just by interacting with the people and living with them. He developed that syllabic writing system with their help. I imagine it was a give and take kind of process, kind of like, hey, does this character make sense to you, right? I'm sure there was a kind of back and forth there. And again, as I said, he produced a catechism, Bible portions, prayer book excerpts, and hymns. He moved from James Bay to Baffin Island in 1894, where he would spend the next 11 years. He would return to England every few years for vacation. He was married, actually, so he would only see his wife occasionally. This is Keckerton Island in Cumberland Sound. You can see here, here's Nunavut, here's Baffin Island, and this zooms in here. There's a community today called Pangnirtung. That didn't exist then, but his mission was on two whaling stations, Blacklead Island here and Keckerton Island here. That is a picture of a whale bone from the whaling days on Keckerton Island. Speaking of whaling, Peck would always hitch rides on whaling vessels. That's how he got back and forth across the Atlantic. And as you read his journals, it becomes clear that he was conflicted about his dependence on the whalers because, well, the whalers would often have sexual relations with the Inuit women, which resulted in many children born out of childbirth, out of wedlock, pardon me. Whalers often didn't stay to raise the children. Furthermore, this introduced venereal diseases, which were threatening the population. So Peck would criticize the whalers for their, quote, immoral influences, which undermined his evangelization efforts. Furthermore, the Inuit who settled at the whaling stations began trading with the whalers and adopting European customs and dress. And the missionaries were actually not in favor of this. For example, Matthias Warmau, he was a Moravian missionary to South Baffin and a contemporary of Peck. He observed, and I quote, "I'm always sorry to see the Eskimo imitating the Europeans in all respects. They were undoubtedly better off in their original state." Peck is commemorated in Wycliffe College's founder's chapel on a stained glass window. You can see it there on the left. Peck is the figure on the top. He was not a Wycliffe graduate, but one of his proteges, Archibald Lang Fleming, was a Wycliffe graduate, class of 1913. Fleming's name appears on the window kind of halfway down there. But the bishop who is depicted is one Isaac Stringer, another Wycliffe graduate. He ministered in the Western Arctic, kind of like Yukon, Northwest Territories area. He is known famously as the bishop who ate his boots. You can look him up on Wikipedia. The story is once while traveling by dog's team, he ran out of food, and faced with starvation, he resorted to eating the leather of his sealskin boots to survive. Now, this window, as you can imagine, has been the subject of some controversy and unease among the Wycliffe community due to concerns about the church's colonial legacy and how that's depicted in the window. And I do think the imagery of the window is unfortunate in that regard. Stringer, as you can see here, is depicted as wearing a rochet and shamir, looking like a good English bishop. But that is not what he and the other missionaries wore in the Arctic. It's clear from the photographs we have and from their journals that they wore caribou skin coats and sealskin boots. They dressed like the Inuit. They lived among the people and dressed like them. And obviously that clothing is much better suited to the Arctic climate than English coral vestments, right? Unfortunately, the image on the window as we have it implies, at least to me, or could be taken to imply, that the missionaries were there not just to preach the gospel to the Inuit, but to make Europeans out of them. Because again, he's dressed like a European preaching to the Inuit. And as I said, that was not the missionaries' goal. They were not there to make Europeans out of them. If Stringer were correctly depicted as wearing a caribou skin coat, I think that would change the dynamics of the image considerably. It wouldn't be such a source of controversy at Wycliffe, because that would signify the proclamation of an enculturated gospel, not a colonially imposed one. Because again, Peck believed that the Inuit should not be Europeanized. He never bothered to teach them English. There was no need for that because in those days there was no colonial society into which they could be assimilated. This was long before the Canadian government extended its reach into the north of this country. Peck's mission was to establish an indigenized church, an Inuktitut language church for the Inuit, eventually to be led by Inuit clergy. I want to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts and sacrifices of these early missionaries. Imagine for a moment what this would have been like. Imagine going to what would have felt like the ends of the earth, far from family, comforts, and conveniences, to live maybe with only one other missionary companion who could speak your language, living amongst people of a vastly different culture and language, eating food you've never had before. Imagine being dropped off by ship, knowing that you would have no contact with the outside world for another year until the ship arrived next summer to bring supplies and maybe a letter from home. Recalling the day the ship departed for the first time, Bishop Fleming wrote, "For a moment, a deep sense of loneliness swept over me. Yet I knew that I was not alone, since he who had called me to the work promised to be with me to the end." Imagine having to learn a completely foreign language by immersing yourself in it and with the aid of only a few resources. Imagine teaching the people and the children how to read and write using that syllabic system while learning it yourself. Imagine spending your days traveling by dog team, visiting with the people in their igloos in the outpost camps. So I know that in this day and age, there is certainly some awkwardness in discussing the history of Christian missions, given some well-founded concerns about the legacy of colonialism, particularly in this country, the abusive residential school system, which came to the north much later, decades after Peck. And so while the reasons for our unease are based on real historical injustices, I think there's also more that needs to be said. One thing that can't be denied is the extraordinary commitment, effort, and sacrifices made by these early missionaries. And as you read their journals, what comes through is not just that they were driven by the Great Commission, but also by a great love for the people. They had a deep and abiding sense that the people were worth it, more than worth all the hardships and the extreme conditions and the efforts it took to learn the language. In keeping with what was called the native church policy of the CMS, Peck was committed, as I said, to the translation and rapid circulation of the scriptures and the prayer book in Inuktitut, and also the training of Inuit lay readers. The first Inuit lay readers commissioned by Peck were Peter Tulugaktuak and Luke Kilapik. Luke is the fellow here. He was one of the first two lay readers. And there you can see Peck on the left, catechizing Inuit, reading them through the catechism or reading to them a portion of the Bible or the prayer book. And the other lay reader I mentioned, Peter Tulugaktuak, he was one of the shamans who converted and became a Christian leader. As I said, Peck was stationed on Blacklead Island and Keckerton Island in Cumberland Sound from 1894 until 1905. He would travel by dog team to the surrounding settlements, but for the most part, the Inuit that he catechized at the whaling stations would then go and spread the gospel message themselves, as I said. So that is a really crucial piece of the history of Eastern Arctic missions that many do not realize. Most Inuit were evangelized by other Inuit. In his journal from May 1895, Peck wrote that in his travels, he was much cheered today by meeting two of the people who had heard much of Jesus from one of the Blacklead Island Eskimo. He was delighted because these folks had heard about Jesus from other Inuit, not from him. Speaking of the word Eskimo, as you probably know, this term is no longer used and is considered derogatory, even though in the past its usage was not always intended as such. It's a word that actually derives from the Cree language, and it means raw eater, someone who eats raw, uncooked meat. Because the Cree who had contact with the Inuit in northern Quebec were struck by the fact that Inuit ate uncooked meat. The Cree could cook their meat because they had wood to burn in the fires, but Inuit who came from further north did not. They were above the tree line. So that's where the name comes from. Eskimo means raw eater. The fact that that stained glass window says Eskimo at the top, you maybe can't see it, that's also a reason for its controversy. The word Inuit is the new term, and that just means people. Inuk is the word for a single person. Inuit is for a group of 3 or more people. So it just means people in general, but it has come to refer to their ethnic group with different words for different nationalities of other people. I was talking about how, for the most part, the gospel message was spread from Inuit to Inuit and how this went hand in hand with the spread of literacy. This was initially unknown to Peck, actually, that the people would meet amongst themselves, read the materials, the catechism. For example, they would discuss among themselves the question of following this new Christian teaching. To this day, consensus decision-making is a very important societal value for Inuit. And so if they could reach a consensus in that group, they would decide to follow Christ, and in some cases undergo that ritual that we saw in the video. So again, I stress that in most cases, the Inuit were not coerced or forced into becoming Christian. Whatever may have been true elsewhere in the history of missions in the world, it wasn't true in the Arctic. They were not coerced into becoming Christian. They decided for themselves to adopt the new faith. And today they see it as part of their cultural heritage, because again, it was the Bible and other Christian texts that made their oral language a written language. And so it contributed to the preservation of that language, which is still spoken today. Of all the indigenous languages in Canada, Inuktitut would probably be the healthiest, would have the most speakers children grow up speaking it as their first language in the northern communities. And so the Inuit hold the Bible in extremely high regard. Many Inuit Anglicans today will carry their Bible and their prayer book with them everywhere they go, often in sealskin bags, kind of like a purse that they hand make for that purpose, just to carry their Bible around. So again, Peck, the early missionaries were there long before the Canadian government extended its colonial reach to the north. Peck showed up on Baffin Island by himself. Sometimes he was accompanied by a missionary companion. Sometimes it was just him there. So in this region, evangelization did not coincide with colonization, but came first. The Inuit became Christian long before they became colonial subjects or Canadians. One of the great tragedies of the residential school system is that it attempted to achieve much the opposite of what Peck intended, essentially making Europeans out of Indigenous children by preventing them from speaking their native language. That kind of imposed cultural linguistic homogeneity, which caused so much abuse, it goes against the true character of the church that we see revealed on the upcoming day of Pentecost, when, as you know in that story from Acts chapter 2, everyone heard the word of God in their own dialect, their own language, right? We also see a similar kind of thing in the book of Revelation chapter 7, where the great multitude from every nation, tribe, and tongue give praise to God around his throne. In his book called Church, Wycliffe Professor Emeritus Ephraim Radner, he speaks of coming to terms with the church's historical sins, in this case, the residential school system. And he says, the church's sins are real, but they are against its own divine mission at its root. They are sins against the church's own soul, and the soul of the church lies with its Lord. Again, the church, in running those schools and preventing the children from speaking their language, they were kind of acting against the spirit of the day of Pentecost, right? In the Creed, when we confess that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, what we mean by that in part is that the King of Kings and Lord of Lords was a member of a colonially subjugated people. Right? The Roman Empire, of which Pilate was the local representative, had colonized Judea and the Jewish people, and Jesus was put to death on a Roman cross. He was the victim of the violence of empire. So the intergenerational trauma from residential schools and other historical injustices is real, and I saw the aftermath of it every day in the North and the social problems that are there. So that legacy is real. But to conclude from that, the assumption that the Christian faith was, in every case, a colonially imposed imposition upon an unwilling indigenous population is historically inaccurate, because again, they chose to become Christian for the most part and spread the message themselves. So it's historically inaccurate to say that they were forced to become Christian. It's also disrespectful, I would say, because it fails to account for the fact that the Inuit have chosen to be Christian and still choose to be Christian today. And many have found healing from intergenerational trauma through the gospel, the work of the Spirit. Inuit Anglicans believe deeply in the power of prayer and the ability of the Holy Spirit to heal, transform, and to make all things new. I've talked about Peck. I want to move to a more recent missionary couple. This is Mike Gardner and his wife, Margaret. They arrived on Baffin Island in 1955. They were unmarried at this point, but engaged to be married. And because they weren't married, the bishop didn't want them together. So he put Mike in Lake Harbor, Kimmeroot, and Margaret 400 kilometers away in Pangnirtung. So Mike was a kind of missionary priest. She was working in the hospital. They would connect by radio for that year. And eventually they got married on the ship C.D. Howe. There you see Mike on the left cutting freshwater ice to use for drinking water. That's what he's doing. And then you can see his wife on the right wearing a traditional Inuit amauti. That's a woman's parka with an oversized hood, which is kind of a baby backpack. These are still worn today. They had 3 daughters which were born there. And though they're white of English stock, his daughters grew up speaking Inuktitut as their first language, and they all still live there. Mike wrote memoirs. I'll show you the cover of his book in just a minute. And in his memoirs, he records that the bishop required him to preach and lead worship in Inuktitut on his first Sunday, because in those days, the Inuit did not speak English. So what he did was sort of take those texts that were translated by Peck, right? Bits of the prayer book and the Bible. He would convert the syllabics into Latin script, and he would just kind of read them, some Bible verses strung together. That was all he could do at that time, right? But he endeavored to learn 5 words a day, and he's still alive. He's well into his 90s, but he became fluently bilingual just from living among the people. He wrote in his memoirs, "I felt I had to be more a part of the Inuit culture and not be like some outsider who would just observe people and go away." They moved around various communities in South Baffin. They ended up in Pangnirtung, that's the community in Cumberland Sound I showed you earlier, where Mike served as the first principal of the Arthur Turner Training School. This is the Bible college that is still in operation in the Diocese of the Arctic. And its purpose was to train Inuit for Anglican ministry. One of Mike's students is the Reverend Jonas Alulu, also one of my predecessors as Dean of the Arctic. He was one of the 5 Inuit Anglican priests who translated the entire Bible into Inuktitut, because before them only bits and pieces had been translated, only certain books, but they did all 66 books, and that came out in the year 2012. But there's still ongoing revisions that they're doing, and Jonas still works on that. Those are his memoirs there. You can read it on Kindle or order it from Amazon. It's self-published there. And there's Mike on the right in front of St. Jude's Cathedral. So I said they had 3 daughters. They grew up speaking Inuktitut as their first language. They all married Inuit men. And Mike's grandson, PJ Akiarok, is the current premier of Nunavut.
Wow.
I got to know him because Iqaluit is a capital city of 8,000 people. So it's no big deal to see the premier and the minister of justice around town, right? They'd come to church for funerals and services and things. So I got to know him a bit.
He was at Parliament this week.
Was he really? Yeah.
I believe he was.
Yeah.
Looks like a very familiar looking face.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the King's speech.
Yes, you would have been. That's right. So the impact of the Gardeners' decades-long ministry in the Baffin region is immeasurable, and they carried on the legacy of Peck, which I was talking about, living among the people, prioritizing the Inuktitut language, and raising up Inuit church leaders. And to this day, Inuktitut language services are kind of the calling card of the Anglican Church in the north. In Iqaluit, which is a city that has probably 7 or 8 churches, there are only 2 that worship in Inuktitut, and the Anglican Church is one of them. I pass this around to the hymn books that we use, if you're interested in seeing it. The cathedral is one of the few places folks can go in Iqaluit where they can hear and read and sing in the Inuktitut language. Okay, just in conclusion, I just want to talk about the Diocese of the Arctic today. There you see on the left the territory it covers. So all of the Northwest Territories, all of Nunavut, and northern Quebec, which is called the Nunavik region. So where the Inuit people live in Quebec, that is part of the Diocese of the Arctic too. So it's 4 million square kilometers.
Wow.
It is the largest Anglican diocese by area in the world. 1/3 of the landmass of Canada. And so for that reason, we need 4 bishops, one in kind of each region. I was just at the synod, when was it, 2 weeks ago? So they consecrated 3 new bishops. The diocesan bishop is Alex Pryor there in the middle. He is from Newfoundland originally. Jared Osborne on the right, originally an American, but he and his wife have been serving in the Arctic for years. They've really become assimilated and have learned the language quite well. And the one on the left is my good friend Anne Martha Kinainek. She's an Inuk priest. We served together in the Iqaluit. Those are the 3 new bishops. The 4th bishop is the one from northern Quebec. She is Annie Yettushat. She did her MDiv at Wycliffe, actually. There she is on the left, smoking Arctic char. Yeah. And the group of 4 on the right are newly ordained deacons at St. Jude's Cathedral. So they were lay readers when I was there, and they were ordained just after me. So they're recent graduates of the Arthur Turner Training School. So you can see their academic hoods are made of sealskin. This is a kind of a group shot of clergy and lay leaders from Synod. Now, the missionary work I was talking about started by Peck, that began in the late 19th century. The diocese itself wasn't established until 1933. Because of its missionary history and the fact that most of its clergy in the early days came from missionary organizations in England, that's why the diocese has always been evangelical in its ethos. And beginning in the 1970s, that took on a charismatic flavor when the Pentecostal movement moved north. So to this day, the kind of default standard expression of the Christian faith for Inuit Anglicans is charismatic. So our church would have an Inuktitut prayer book service on Sunday morning, but Sunday evening there'd be a praise and worship service with kind of a praise band and a sermon and personal testimony and prayers for healing. As I mentioned, I'm still canonically resident up there, despite having taken up a new position at Wycliffe. And the reason I maintain that affiliation is because I want to stay connected to something that I think is really quite extraordinary. Arctic Anglicans offer a model of a truly Holy Spirit anointed church. One that, and by that I mean, the diocese has achieved a remarkable degree of ethnic and linguistic integration between diverse people, precisely and only because it is centered on the Word made flesh and enlivened by his reconciling spirit. And all of that was on full display at the recent synod. That's where this picture comes from. The vast majority of clergy and lay delegates were Inuit. Other synod members who now call the North home were born and raised in places as diverse as Australia, India, Newfoundland, the Philippines, the United States, and Zimbabwe. In fact, I was talking to one of you. You have a member of this church whose father is a priest in the Arctic. Yeah, Kalas Machoko is the priest in Kugluktuk in the Central Arctic. So I didn't know.
You said synod. Do you mean an Arctic synod? Because we have synod here, and I don't recall seeing any of those guys there.
Each diocese has its own synod.
Gotcha.
So the Arctic synod meets every 3 years, usually. It's very expensive to get everyone together because flights and travel in the north is very expensive. So when they get everyone together for synod, they stretch it out to make the most of it to 10 days, and they do not just business, but training, education for lay readers and clergy. It's a bilingual diocese, so the convening circular, the document was published in English and Inuktitut. Synod proceedings were conducted in both languages using simultaneous translation technology. So if a speaker is speaking in English, there's an interpreter over on the side listening, and then they speak into a microphone, and everyone is wearing a kind of radio headset where they can hear the translation. That's pretty cool. The Bible Society was there. They had a kind of session with the people to ask them how particular translation decisions were being received in parishes. In English, we've had Bibles for centuries, and we have many different versions of the English Bible. But we've been able to work through kind of typos and translation errors and that sort of thing. But all this is still quite new there, right? The Bible was only translated in full in 2012. So there are errors and things that need to be adjusted, right? So they're getting feedback from the people on that. Yeah, there was daily worship services. Most prayers and songs were Inuktitut led. No problem. No problem. Most the prayers and the songs in the worship services were Inuktitut led. Whenever possible, they displayed the words in both languages on a screen. But when they weren't displayed, the rest of us just would pray silently, or we would try to manage the Inuktitut if we had learned it, or we would just join in the language of our own hearts. I learned a little bit of the language in my 2.5 years there. I didn't make much progress conversationally, but I was expected to speak it liturgically, so I could say the priest's part of the service. The benefit of Anglican prayers is that they're written down, so I was able just to copy them out and practice and get tips on the pronunciation. So it was great to be back with them and singing some of the hymns that are in that hymn book. It was a traditional feast. It was a joyous time. And as I said, because of the bilingualism, because the Indigenous language is not only preserved, but prioritized, we see that spirit of the day of Pentecost, right? Everyone worshiping in their own language. We had an English language service and an Inuktitut service when I was in Iqaluit. And even though most Inuit are now bilingual, all Inuit under the age of 70 would speak English fluently, and yet they all would still go to the Inuktitut service because it's just the language of their own hearts. And that's how they express their faith. I encourage you to follow the Arctic News. I don't know if you have a cell phone. You could scan the QR code and sign up for the email newsletter, which comes weekly, stories about what's going on in the various parishes. Just in conclusion, before I field some questions, I wanted to show you some pictures. So there's a royal connection to Iqaluit. Queen Elizabeth was there in 1970 to turn the sod on the building of the first Igloo Church Cathedral. The one you saw in the picture is the second one. The first burned down in 2005. They built the new one. So the Queen was there to turn the sod in 1970 on the building of the first one, and that was the shovel that she used. And then in 2017, when the church was consecrated, they had Prince Edward from the royal family there for that occasion. And the Queen said famously, until you've seen the North, you've not really seen Canada. So if you're able to go, I encourage you to go and see it. It is indescribably beautiful. Some of these photographs I'm going to show are taken by one of my clergy colleagues, Esau Tatatwapik. That is the community of Clyde River, North Baffin Island. That is Arctic Bay. That's the third northernmost community in Canada, population 1,000 or less. Dog teams are still used as a kind of hobby. They've been made somewhat obsolete as a method of transportation by the advent of the snowmobile, because feeding the dogs and maintaining the ropes is a lot of work. But people still keep the dog team as a hobby. Polar bears are very common. I never saw one. They tended to stay away from the city, but you see them all the time apparently in the small communities. Arctic summers are really beautiful. So that's Frobisher Bay. I took that picture. I would go hiking along the coast. All kinds of interesting, beautiful plants grow on the tundra in the summer. Those are two of them, very delicate flowers. Lots of rivers, lakes. Those are my three daughters. You can see how beautiful the summer colors are. Daytime high temperatures might be 12 to 15 degrees. So in the evening where that was taken, it's get pretty cool. The Pope was there a few years ago. Remember when he came to Canada to apologize for the residential school system? He went to Edmonton, Quebec City, and Iqaluit. So I was there that day. He heard testimony from residential school survivors. And those two women on the left, Martha and Elizabeth from our church, were part of an Inuktitut choir who sang for him. And that is the cathedral there. Okay, that's all for me. Any questions?
Snow belt to urban belt.
I grew up in Ontario, so it wasn't too foreign for me coming back. I miss the wilderness. I mean, I could just walk from my house out onto the tundra and be in, vast untouched wilderness in minutes, right? Whereas here you have to go a long way to get that.
Well, now I feel that when I walk out to the Humber River every morning.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Was there, or is there any throat singing, which is part of the hymnody there?
The throat singing is not part of the hymnody. The hymns would all be familiar to you, the same tunes that we sing, just with their lyrics. Throat singing is a traditional practice that never really made its way into churches. And some Inuit elders would have strong feelings about that. Some would say it's a non-Christian practice. I don't have those strong feelings. We would have drum dancers and throat singers in church for certain large services. So when the Queen died, we had the memorial service for the territory, and we had drum dancers and throat singers for that. But yeah, no, it's not a typical in Sunday worship, for example. Yeah. Yes, yeah.
I get the feeling that these people are very devout in most cases. And I just wonder, does the whole atmosphere of the geographical location of this and the almost remoteness of it enhance that?
That's a good question. It is true, of the 13 provinces and territories in Canada, Nunavut has the highest percentage of those who identify as Christian and attend church. So there's no doubt that the Christian faith is quite vibrant among Inuit people. Why that is, I'm not sure. It's a good question. Certainly one factor is the influence of the charismatic movement.
Yes.
That kind of emotional expression of the faith it strikes a chord
Yes.
with the people there. Also, partly because of the legacy of residential schools, there are social problems and pain and heartache there. And so the gospel and the faith has been healing and transformative for people. I think that's another reason why.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know how to phrase my question. Sort of, well, the simple way would be, is there the internet there? And I think all technology brings horrible sides and also opportunities. And I know at St. Olave's we have morning prayer on Zoom, and it's a way, if you live somewhere and can't get to church, that you can be with the members of your church and talking to them and do the morning prayer. Like
Right.
we use the prayer book
Right.
that you do. So I guess I'm wondering if there even is that possibility up there, and if it would be good, or if it would be the ways in which it would destroy something that's vital.
There is internet there. Everyone has cell phones. There's cell service, in the
Would it be
in the
helpful
communities.
or is it terrible?
Um, I don't know. It's the North is very modern now, so and they're as connected as we are. I was blown away by this, but Facebook has become an integral part of Inuit life. Everything happens on Facebook. The city of Iqaluit would post its notices and announcements on Facebook first. So it's Facebook and FM radio. Radio is a big deal. In the smaller communities, clergy have a time on Sunday afternoons where they would just go on and preach. So one of my projects there was to establish a church radio station for St. Jude's, because in Iqaluit, despite the fact that it was the capital city, there wasn't a lot of Inuktitut language radio content locally because it was CBC and they had kind of syndicated national content. So there was certainly a thirst for Inuktitut language material on the radio. So the audio Bible was recorded when we were there. So they now play Bible in Inuktitut and they broadcast the services as well. Yes.
You mentioned bilingualism. What about trilingualism? Do they speak French, especially in northern Quebec?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I never went to northern Quebec, but yeah, I think a lot of people would be trilingual there in Quebec. And even in Iqaluit, there's a sizable Quebecois community. There's a French language school in Iqaluit. Yeah.
We should all speak French. I grew up in Montreal.
Did you?
The French I speak is Quebecois,
Right.
but I still speak French. Now the second, sorry, this sounds a little humorous, but I'm watching that show North of North,
Oh yeah.
and I love it. It's a CBC thing with APTN as well.
Yeah.
So the two have combined. Would you say that that shows a good depicts what goes on up in Nunavut, or is it make believe, or is it half and half, or?
I've only seen the first episode. It's kind of stylized, right?
Thank you, that's
But
what-
I think it is accurate. They were actually filming that when I was there.
Yeah,
So a member of the film crew reached out to me because they wanted to film one of the scenes in an Anglican church. Have you seen that episode yet?
yeah.
It's not filmed in this church because the fictional community Ice Cove is meant to be a small community.
Yes.
So it's a small church. There's another Anglican church in a bedroom community called Apex, small town. That's what Ice Cove is, right? It's a small kind of rundown church. That's where they filmed that scene.
7 episodes, you can stream it.
Yeah.
And it's addictive.
Yeah.
It's only a
No,
half hour.
it's quite good.
so,
It's
yeah.
really quite good. Yeah.
So, because it's very, very, I just thought, wow, does life imitate art? Or does art imitate life, But that's good to know.
Yeah.
What are the, in terms of the Christian denominations, how does Anglican stack up against them size wise? Are we one of the bigger ones, smaller?
We would be the largest for sure. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Especially in the Eastern Arctic, most Inuit are Anglican. Some communities would only have an Anglican church and no other. Other communities would have 2 churches, an Anglican church and what's known colloquially as the Full Gospel Church. So when the charismatic movement came north in the 70s and 80s, some Anglicans were influenced by that and broke away and formed their own churches. But then even the Anglicans who remained kind of became charismatic as well, right? So there's Anglicanism, there's the Full Gospel Church, Roman Catholicism, their missions historically centered on the kind of central Arctic, west coast of Hudson Bay, Rankin Inlet, Chesterfield Inlet, that area, also up to Iqaluit. So there aren't many Inuit Roman Catholics in the east. Iqaluit, being a capital city, had other churches. There was a Nigerian charismatic church, if you can believe it. There was a mosque in Iqaluit, so there's a small Muslim community. It's a surprisingly diverse city. But we had a ministerial association. It was us, it was the Pentecostal church. There was another Pentecostal church, the Nigerian Pentecostal church. They were there. The Full Gospel Church. There was a Baptist church as well. The pastor was an American Baptist missionary. Yeah, so Iqaluit would have about 7 churches.
Well, I think we should
Thank
wrap it
you.
up, Chris.
Sure.
This has been really, really delightful, really interesting. I
Yeah,
think
it's
it's
wonderful.
speak for all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing us along on this journey.